Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Cardinali. I'm the president and the CEO of Independent Sector, and really grateful for you all participating today in this webinar. It is the second annual trust report announcement, and it is becoming for us an important contribution to really understanding the level of trust the general population in the United States has for those of us working in nonprofits or in philanthropic institutions of one sort or another. Why do we think this is an important thing to talk about? Because we know historically that for those of us who are in the civil society, that trust is the currency with which we do our work. If you think about it, we rely on folks donating or volunteering or giving their ideas or attending our organizations. And they do that because they trust us. They trust that we are spending our time and our energy, whether as volunteers or professional staff, to serve the common good and steward the environment. And to the extent that that trust is deep, is the extent to which folks join with in some way, shape, or form. So knowing the level of trust and figuring out ways to make sure that we are stewarding that trust and ideally growing it becomes a very important work, regardless of what you do on a daily basis, whether you're a line staff person, a board member, a volunteer, a philanthropist, a donor. It's important to see yourself as both contributing and consuming the level of trust in civil society. So today's webinar is an important moment. About 2 years ago, Independent Sector partnered with Edelman Intelligence and Data to develop the largest and statistically significant measure of trust that the general population has for nonprofits and philanthropic institutions. And we're embarking now on sharing that information with you, and ideally with you making sense of what it means and what we want to do about it. So today's webinar is a first overture to first, most importantly, understand the data and really make sure folks have a clear understanding. We're going to have Edelman present that data. And then we have two sector leaders, one current board member, Phoebe Boyer, who runs the Children AIDS Society and is a longtime sector leader both on the philanthropic and nonprofit front, and Art Taylor, who is the multi-decade leader of BBB Wise Giving and himself an expert in trust in civil society, as BBB Wise Giving does some important work. So we're going to get some of their reflections, and then it will be very important for those of you who've joined us. If you have questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A function. And if you have comments and tell us where you're from, you can put those in the chat now, just who you are and where you're coming from, so we can get a sense of who you are. So again, thank you for joining us. And I do want to take a moment. This is being broadcast from Washington, D.C., which is the ancestral home of the Piscataway and Nanskotchint and Anacostan people, who are still working daily to preserve their culture and restore their lands. It is also the home of a number of buildings that were built by enslaved people. And we want to acknowledge both those realities. We also want to take a moment and just remember the more than 600,000 people who have lost their lives to COVID. So why don't we just take a moment and hold those people in our heart. Thank you. And so for the first segment of this webinar, we're going to ask Victor Tolomeo from Edelman Data and Intelligence to share the findings from the 2021 Trust Survey. Over to you, Victor.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dan. Well, I'm going to share my screen to bring up the slides. It's great to be with all of you today. I think this has been a really fascinating experience to see this data and to kind of get a really deep dive into trust in into the sector. So I'm very excited, and I can speak from everyone on the Edelman side. That we're all very enthusiastic and excited about this this process, and I'm looking forward to going through the data with all of you in a little bit of detail. So before we jump into the data in detail, I wanted to go through just a few quick key findings. And the first is that we see that institutional trust is declining. So at Edelman, we have 20 years of experience diagnosing trust in institutions. And what we found was that trust increased significantly at the beginning of the pandemic, but since then it has seemed to have receded. And that's in government, media, nonprofit organizations, and business. So across all the major sectors of American life. And as I said, nonprofits and philanthropy are not immune to this trend. What we've seen in this data is that we've also see some decreases, maybe some stagnation in trust this year compared to last year when we conducted the first wave of this study. The second finding is that there are some trust disparities that align with broader social trends. So as I'll speak to in more detail, what we found in the first wave of the study last year was that generally trust is very correlated with socioeconomic status. So those who have higher levels of education, have higher incomes, maybe live in urban areas, are the ones who trust nonprofits the most. And what we saw this year was that that trend is very consistent, and some of these disparities by education, by income, have deepened. The third point is that, even amidst this environment, there still is, I think, a fair amount of public confidence in the nonprofit sector as a force for good. We also found that civic action and trust seem to reinforce each other, that people who regularly volunteer or donate or even are registered to vote tend to have higher trust in nonprofits. Another point that came out in the data was that greater engagement with nonprofits seems to breed trust, or is highly correlated with trust. Individuals who are most familiar with nonprofits, or who report the highest familiarity with these organizations, are the ones who trust the sector the most. And we also see that respondents express a preference in our study for nonprofits that are active in their local environments, that they might have more of a relationship with than other organizations. And then finally, looking at what fuels trust, not just in the sector, but in, say, an individual organization, we find that purpose, so that is the intent to really improve society, or altruism, and then also integrity, acting with honesty, with transparency, with ethics, really fuel trust in nonprofits the most. So moving on, we'll go through some of these data points in a little bit more detail. And the first is, like I said, I just wanted to show, this is a slide from Edelman's 2021 trust barometer. This is not data from our survey, but I just wanted to show this for a little bit of context setting. We saw that trust increased dramatically in most institutions between January 2020 and May of 2020, so right when the pandemic hit. But then, looking a little bit further into this year, we see that trust has receded a little bit. And I think what we've seen with trust in our study really confirms this. So as Dan mentioned, we know that trust is a very necessary condition for American support of nonprofit organizations. In our study, 83% of respondents said that nonprofits must earn my trust before I support them. And we also see that trust is a very key motivator, at least as respondents report it, for supporting nonprofit organizations. We asked about a variety of factors that might motivate support for an individual nonprofit organization, and we asked respondents to rank them on a scale from 1 to 10, where 10 was most motivating and 1 was least motivating. We see that trust the organization to do what is right is an 8. The only thing higher than that is the organization supporting an issue that respondents care about, which is a 9. So trust, very important, very key for support in nonprofits. So moving into measuring trust capital itself, We see that compared to when we conducted the first wave of this study in 2020, we see that trust in nonprofit organizations has held somewhat steady, but trust in philanthropy has substantially declined. And just a quick note on how we're measuring this. We ask respondents to rate their trust on a 9-point scale. If they respond with a 7, 8, or 9, we code that as high trust. If they respond with a 1 through a 4, that would be low trust. And then to get this net trust score, kind of an overall number that kind of encapsulates their trust, we take high trust percent and subtract off the low trust percent. So in 2021, the trust score for nonprofits was 45, for philanthropy it was 4. Quickly diving a little bit deeper into trust in some of the nonprofit subsectors, we see that trust in some of these has declined year over year since 2020, specifically in the health and human services sector. And we see that trust is a little bit weaker for places of worship, for arts, humanities, and culture, and the environment. I will note that arts, humanities, and culture and the environment were added this year, so we don't have tracking data for 2020 to compare it with. And I'll get into some of the reasons why people trust or don't trust in a moment. But as I said, I think the one silver lining to this is that even amid the upheaval of the past year with the pandemic and some of these trust declines, the public still has a great deal of confidence in both nonprofits and philanthropy that they have the ability to strengthen society. So the question we asked was, how confident are you in the ability of nonprofit organizations or philanthropy to strengthen American society? So they have confidence that these organizations can play a role. They have the ability to do so. And furthermore, what they want to see from them is they really want to see these organizations focused on helping the less fortunate, addressing some of the societal challenges that we face. We want to see them make change and lead by example. Also wanted to take a moment to talk about some of the reasons why people trust or distrust nonprofits and philanthropy. It's pretty consistent across both. Generally, for those people who expressed high trust in nonprofits or philanthropy, they say, well, these organizations, they help people. They work for the greater good. They're aware of organizations that have long track records of success. They believe that the work they do supports good causes. For those who have low trust in nonprofits or in philanthropy, it's usually about potential ethical concerns. So people will say that they have the perception that the money doesn't go where it should go. There's too much going to overhead, or maybe in the case of philanthropy, they're not in it for the right reasons. So again, kind of going to that integrity or purpose dimension of trust that I mentioned earlier. In terms of the demographics of who trusts and who doesn't, like I mentioned, we do see this disparity that is very correlated with socioeconomic status. Those who have college degrees or have higher levels of income, maybe live in urban areas, probably more likely to be registered to vote as Democrats, are more likely to have high trust. And the opposite of that, so those with lower education, lower income levels, are most likely to express distrust. And we'll see some of this in a little bit more detail, specifically for the nonprofit sector. So if you look at, for example, education on the left of this slide, you'll see that if you split the sample by those who have less than a bachelor's degree and then those who have a bachelor's degree or some sort of graduate degree, higher education, you see there's quite a disparity in trust. The trust score in 2021 for those with a BA or higher was 60. For those with less than a 4-year degree, it was 40. So that's a 20-point gap. There's also disparities by urbanicity, whether you live in an urban, suburban, or rural area, and by political affiliation. There doesn't seem to be much of a gender gap in terms of trust, but there do seem to be some interesting trends by generation, where generally speaking, older respondents in our survey tended to express the most trust, and younger respondents, millennials, Gen Z, tended to express lower trust in the sector. And then, as I mentioned, another interesting cut of the data is that those who are familiar with nonprofits and philanthropy are substantially more likely to express high trust than those who are not. For nonprofits, it's almost a 30-point gap. For philanthropy, also quite a large gap between those who are familiar with the sector and those who are not. But notably, for philanthropy, the trust is just much lower generally. Also wanted to point out that there's a finding that about 2/3 of Americans say that they are more likely to trust a nonprofit that has a presence, in their local community. And the reasons for that are they want to see firsthand, they want to have firsthand knowledge of the impact that the organization is making. If it's active in their local community, they're more likely to be able to see the good it does. They're able to see the organization give back to the community. There's also kind of an interesting finding that for those who say that they regularly received some type of service from a nonprofit organization before the pandemic, among those, about 4 in 10 say that their interactions with an individual nonprofit improved their impression of the nonprofit sector generally. So again, this point that more engagement, more familiarity is breeding trust or better impressions. And then, as I mentioned, civic engagement is also quite correlated with trust. Those who regularly donate money or volunteer their time or register to vote all have higher trust in nonprofits than those who do not. So very quickly, at Edelman, I mentioned we have 2 decades of experience diagnosing trust, and what we found is that trust, there are 4 sub-components, dimensions of trust. They are ability, being good at what you do; integrity, being honest; dependability, that's consistency, reliability, keeping your promises; and then purpose, trying hard to have a positive impact on society. And when we evaluate these 4 dimensions for nonprofits and philanthropy, we see that performance on these dimensions has not really changed for nonprofits compared to last year. But for some of these dimensions, specifically ability, integrity, dependability, we do see some declines for philanthropy. I think this is consistent with the top line result that trust in philanthropy generally has declined. I wanted to make a quick note that we did some statistical analysis on the survey data to identify which of these dimensions has the most contribution to trust. So basically, a statistical analysis to determine the strength of the association between any of these dimensions and trust in the sector. And what we found was that there is the strongest association between purpose and integrity. And so digging a little bit deeper into that, what we found was that many purpose-related drivers, so these are characteristics or attributes or actions that organizations could possibly take that are related to purpose, had the most impact on trust for those organizations. We call those trust drivers. So the top trust drivers for nonprofits are having a clear mission for your organization, demonstrating benefit to the community, engaging the underserved, demonstrating how support for the organization leads to results, and then finally, endorsements from trusted public figures. Philanthropy, it's very similar again. having clear values, engaging the underserved, partnerships, endorsements with public figures. And we think of these as the levers that a specific organization could pull to increase their own trust. So I think that concludes this this section and I will turn this over to, I believe,
back to me. But before you do that, Victor, there's a couple questions I think that are clarifying questions, and we have got some time. So why don't we wrestle with those? The first one comes from Tony Macklin, who asks, can you say more about the connection or not between confidence in nonprofits, which seems very high, and trust in nonprofits, which dropped?
Yes, absolutely. I think the best way to think about it is to go back to the questions, the exact survey questions we asked. So for confidence, it's do nonprofit organizations have, how confident are you in their ability to strengthen American society? Versus for trust, we ask, how much do you trust nonprofit organizations to do what is right? So I think the difference is in having the ability versus perceived intent, maybe that they will follow through or that it will actually happen. So I think trust is more to the intent side of things as opposed to simply the possibility of doing something.
Super, thank you. And there's another question, but I want to just say to those who are listening, if you have further clarification questions, we're going to have time at the end for more kind of a perspective or musing questions. But if there's something that isn't clear, please send that now. Victor, there's another question that thanked you for the overview, and they ask, do you have a breakdown of the racial demographics of the sample?
We do. I unfortunately, I do not have it in this deck in front of me, but the survey was, we designed the sampling plan and it was weighted to be representative of the US adult over 18 population along race and ethnicity, age, gender, education, income, urbanicity, all of the major demographics that you would traditionally weight a survey on or make sure that you've sufficiently sampled, we make sure we did that. So I think the results for the survey are representative of the American adult population.
And I'm anticipating what may be a follow-on question or a concern is, will we make that data available? I think the answer to that is yes.
Yes, it is available.
Great. And then Twyla Lamar asks, can you talk more about the role of celebrities, influencers, public figures? Slide 24 says public figures were a second in importance for trust in nonprofits, but an earlier slide ranked them much lower.
Yes, so I can address the discrepancy there first. I think the difference is between people. So let me back up. So this slide that I showed, this was the result of a statistical analysis of associations within the data. So this was not based on a survey question where people, gave us a response. This was kind of looking at the associations between how people responded on some questions. So it's a modeled measure. The previous question, where endorsements from celebrities was quite lower on the scale, that was what they directly told us. So I think there's maybe a somewhat of motivated reporting here, where people may not want to admit that celebrities or public figures have such a have a large impact on their perceptions. But when we look at the data and run a model on it, we find there is a very strong relationship. And maybe one explanation, I don't have any clear evidence that says yes, this is why, but I think a good explanation could go back to that question of familiarity that we spoke about earlier. It could be that partnerships with government or business or endorsements from trusted public figures maybe might lend some of that familiarity, some of that credibility to an organization that otherwise may not be quite as well known.
Super. Thank you, Victor. I'm going to ask Phoebe and Art, and just so the viewers know, we've also have a colleague of Art's joining us, Elvia Castro, who Art is got a little bit of an unstable internet connect. So in the event that he is unable to participate, Elvia is going to wing him. So a question to both of you. I'll start with you, Phoebe. What findings did you find kind of most interesting, given your daily work and the community that you serve? You run the largest, if I'm not mistaken, a multi-service organization in New York City. So what does this mean for you?
Well, one of them, Dan. I think, you know, what I would say to you that resonates, I mean, trust is, as you said, it's the currency that we have in this sector. And that is both with our clients, with our staff, especially during a pandemic, and as well as with our funders and our government partners. I think the thing that is resonating for me is how important that trust is. As Victor was just talking about, the familiarity, the on the ground local connection is something as a direct service provider we take very seriously in making sure that our clients trust us, that they know that we are there. And I think you're seeing that through the survey. It's also resonates for me because it's what our government and our funding partners rely on, right? We do things and are able to do work that government and foundations cannot do because we are on the direct front lines. And I think as we think about how to build greater trust, what I hope comes out of having this information is just a deeper belief and a way of working that focuses on the end user, both what they need and the way they need it, as opposed to a sort of removed and on high implementation of ideas versus again, what is needed on the ground.
Super. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Art, I'm going to turn over to you. You run a national civil society infrastructure organization. You've been doing the trust work for a very long time. What do you see kind of the most valuable data that the sector as a whole should be paying attention to?
Well, you know, fundraising, Dan, is so important to our sector. And so we've been doing some studies over the last 3 years, just trying to keep pace of how charities are reaching out to new communities or communities that they may have ignored in the past, mainly minority communities. And what's clear to us in the data that we've gathered through our donor trust report is that charities haven't quite figured out yet how to speak to these groups that traditionally haven't been solicited as much. And yet these individuals have told us in the surveys that they would like to be solicited more. And so we would talk to charities about this discrepancy. And what we would hear is that, you know, we sort of have to focus on the areas that bring us the most money. We don't really have resources to go after, you know, these other communities right now. We're not sure how to appeal to them, frankly. And so that is a big concern given the nature of our demographic nature of our society, how things are shifting, that charities haven't quite yet figured out and don't seem to be able to put the resources together to figure out how to reach out to that group. So the question that was posed earlier about what's the demographic and racial breakdown of the survey, it's really important to pay attention to. So that's one thing. The second thing is just this overall thought that in our surveys, we've seen that while charities, like you're seeing in your surveys, are the most trusted, there does seem to be what we consider to be a trust gap, meaning that many donors, 74% or so of donors surveyed will say that it's really important to trust a charity before giving. And yet only about 14% of those folks would say they highly trust charities. So that's a discrepancy that we've been paying some attention to, because we think over time that could also lead to some work that we need to do as charitable organizations to get people to more highly trust us. So those are just two opening thoughts,
Yeah.
but I think this data is really helpful, and I look forward to answering some more questions that may come up.
That's great. So to each of you, one kind of, for this segment, we're going to come back, but as you think about whether it's going this week to your senior team or to your board or both, and say, hey, let me just give you the headline. This is what I think is really what I'm taking away from this survey that I think is important to pay attention to. What's that headline from the survey so far that you're kind of saying, this really merits sharing with folks that are in leadership positions that can do something about it? Phoebe, do you want to?
Sure. I mean, I think for me as a human services provider, I am struck by that drop at a time where we have been on the front lines, and our experience is not that. So I'm wondering what's happening in the health and human services sector, and where are we being closely linked to the drop in government trust as an aid, potentially being seen as an agent of government. And so how do both differentiate ourselves if that's in fact the case? Because I think we are a partner to government, but importantly independent from it.
Sure. Yeah.
And so that has me a little bit concerned as well. I also think the incredible drop in philanthropy is another significant one. Again, as an organization that relies heavily on philanthropic dollars and foundation support, there's also a pretty intense power dynamic there. And so I think it illustrates maybe different ways of working with direct service providers. And so that's another area that I'm paying attention to.
Super. I would agree with that, both points. Art, for you, what's the headline you'll be taking into the boardroom or with your senior team or with Elvia?
Well, the one that pops out to me is the importance that people place on celebrities. I think that that is sort of a loaded area to sort of rely on to trust a charitable organization, given that we can't advertise ourselves in the same way that businesses do. Many cases, celebrities are, for the most part, pitch people, and I wonder if people are looking at celebrities more from the standpoint of their ability to move a cause as opposed to an organization. If someone were to say to you, which organization should I support? That might be different than saying, we should support animal welfare,
Right.
And so I wonder, based on, how they answered that question, if we should take a deeper look at what that really means, the reliance that people are placing on celebrities to really know if they should trust an organization.
Super. Yeah.
Dan,
Go
can
ahead,
I
Phoebe,
add some?
please.
I think also as we think about authentic voices talking about this work, there's a real disconnect for me on the celebrity piece. And so I just echo Art's comments, because I think when we think about the voices of our clients and elevating them in an authentic way, how does that balance out, and what is it saying about actually society's knowledge of the complexities of this sector? Are we not doing a good enough job explaining our role and impact?
It's an excellent point. And if you think about, to your point, the complexity of the sector, I mean, it touches every aspect of American life. And yet people, I'm sure we've all experienced this, when you say you work for a nonprofit, they kind of get that lovely, warm, oh, wow, that must be incredibly rewarding. Like, actually, I'm running a multi-million-dollar business that has lots of, challenges like everybody else. And they're like, well, what do you mean? So there's a lot there, I think, to unpack. I want to just take a pause, flip it back to Victor. We had one question in the chat. I know he's going to pick up regarding the differences in trust based on race. But we also, at Independent Sector, believe data is a tool. It's not an end in of itself to really help us understand and grow and then do something with it. So with Edelman, we began to kind of explore this year some emerging trends and some questions. And Victor's going to kind of tee those up for us to have a conversation with Phoebe and Art. And then with you all, feel free to, again, to put your comments in the chat or ask questions. Go ahead, Art or Victor.
Thanks, Dan. Let me bring up the slides again. I actually was just able to bring in the trust by ethnicity. So I think we can briefly talk to that. So, to the question about trust differences by race, I think what we found was that in this wave, white Americans, Black, Hispanic Americans had very similar trust in nonprofits. And we saw the same for philanthropy. So I'm just going to show the nonprofit data. The trust score for whites was 45, for Black Americans 44, for Hispanic Americans 43, or Hispanic respondents. For Asians, it was a little bit elevated. It was 60. We did look at the open-end responses in the survey to see if there was anything that was unique to that population that might explain the elevated trust. And I think there's many possible explanations you could come up with, but I think something we would like to look into in the future waves of this would be to really get some qualitative research to really dig into, really get more depth into the reasons why people trust and why people don't trust, and especially going and looking at some of these demographic cuts of the data to see what's unique and what is really driving any differences we see.
Super, thank you. And do you want to continue kind of with some of the questions that have been emerging?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that'd be great. So
from this data, we kind of brainstormed, and we think there's 6 questions that come out of some implications that come out of the data in this wave of the study. And the first is, why did we see these trust declines? As we saw in the trust barometer and some other publicly available data, trust increased at the beginning of the pandemic, but it seems to have receded. Why is that? Secondly, how can we clarify some of these disparities in trust across groups? So primarily the socioeconomic divides, education, income. And then third, how can the sector leverage this perception that it has the ability to be a force for good in society? Fourth, what resources do nonprofits need in order to build trust? And how can they support civic action to maintain trust, since we know that civic action through voting, volunteering is very correlated with trust in the sector? Another question, how can nonprofits with differing levels of direct service engagement, direct service to the public, engage in ways that increase trust in the sector? We know that engagement with nonprofits is very correlated, might lead to increased levels of trust. So how can different nonprofits, how can they more directly engage with the public if possible? And then finally, the last question, how can these strategic drivers of trust, so integrity, purpose, that we talked about, how can they be scaled to apply to trust in the entire sector rather than just trust in individual organizations? So these are the kind of some questions that come out of the data. I have a couple other data points that I wanted to share, just to kind of go deeper on a couple items and provide some food for thought. So again, looking at the demographic drivers of trust, we ran a statistical model on the data to measure the strength of the associations between various demographics and trust in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors. And this was on this waves data, so 2021. And where we found that the main, most statistically significant items here, college education obviously is a huge one. Age, attending religious services for nonprofits, registered to vote as a Democrat, also Asian ethnicity, as I mentioned, compared to other races in this survey, they did have higher levels of trust in nonprofits. We did not see this in the 2020 data, so I think we'll want to, in 2022, confirm whether this is a trend or not. And like I said, have some really qualitative research to really get into answer the why as to some of these. I also wanted to cut the racial and ethnic data by education and income, because I think what you see is that income and education, these effects, these disparities in trust between upper income, upper education, and those on the lower end of the spectrum, they're present within the data, within essentially all of the racial groups. The Asian American subsample in our data was unfortunately not large enough when you cut it by other demographics to draw any conclusions about whether something is a statistically significant difference. But we see that there are statistically significant differences within the white subsample, within Black respondents, within Hispanic respondents, between those who are on the lower side of the income scale and those who are on the upper side, and also between those who have college degrees and who don't have college degrees. So I think what the data implies is that the primary divider, the primary driver of trust here really is related to socioeconomic status. Another point I wanted to share was that it seems that those who regularly receive services from nonprofits tend to have higher trust in the sector as a whole. We see that those who attend religious services, overall trust in the sector is 60. Those who attend or participate in arts programming is 55. Those who participate in or maybe have their children participate in club sports or camps or youth development organizations, 54. But we also see it's a little bit elevated for those who receive goods or monetary assistance or healthcare, health advice. And for reference, the overall trust in the nonprofit sector for the entire sample was 45. So for all of these ways of potentially receiving services from nonprofits, they are associated with higher trust in the sector. And then finally, I wanted to quickly break out some of the data on worship attendance. We see a really striking correlation between frequency of worship attendance and trust in nonprofits generally. For those who never attend, it's 35, that's below the total sample. For those who rarely attend, it's about on average with the sample as a whole. For those who sometimes attend, it's 52. And then for those who often attend, it's 67, so quite high. And as we saw with income and education, this effect, this disparity between those who regularly attend some sort of worship service and those who do not, is present within other cuts of the data. So it's present for those who are college educated, It's present among those who are upper income. It's present among your political persuasions, and it's present by age, by generation of the survey respondent. So I think there's a very strong correlation here. We don't have super clear evidence that explains the why behind some of these things that some of these data points that I've just gone through. So I think it raises a lot of questions, and like I said, we'll want to dig into some of these findings deeper next year.
Super, thank you, Victor. With a couple questions, and I'm going to ask Phoebe and Art to both kind of give with these open-ended questions, what's grabbing them, what do they think they're both are leading organizations and driving work at their board levels and others. And these questions we think are pertinent, but the question is, are they, and what other questions might be? So the first question is for you, Victor, is did the survey include a question on generalized trust? That is, can most people be trusted?
We did not include that in this study. I think that's a great addition, and potentially something to include in future waves, but we did not have that.
Great. Another question. Go ahead.
Allison, I just wanted to ask Victor, in response to this question, could you speak to the data that you do have where we were asking respondents how many people or who is best equipped to improve society? And I think the highest response rate was everyday people had the highest response, and then nonprofits. Can you speak to that for just a second?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. We did ask a question about what institution or what kind of people were best positioned to make change or improve society. And we saw that the top response was everyday people. It's not really surprising to us. We've seen this sort of response in a lot of the other data, a lot of the other research that we do at Edelman, where people seem to think that individuals, everyday people like them, are better positioned to make change, to benefit society than any particular institution. What we've seen is a general decrease in trust in institutions over the last few years. So I think I think that might shed some light on how a lot of survey respondents were thinking about some of these questions. But in general, there is a kind of a preference for individuals over institutions, and this has been a trend that we've seen for years now.
Super. So a question actually for Phoebe, Victor, and Art. Do you believe the better use of technology available can help increase the reach to build visibility leading to contributions? Do you believe the better use of technology, available technology, can help increase the reach to build visibility leading to contributions? Are nonprofit orgs having trouble integrating technology into the aspects of other operations as it relates to trust?
Well, I would just start out by suggesting that the nonprofit sector, in my opinion, is probably behind technologically other sectors, and that is for obvious reasons that we don't spend enough money on our own internal infrastructure because we're somewhat concerned about how people will perceive that kind of spending. But I think there are gains to be made, and yet it's a very, very difficult challenge for us because you don't just create a technology and it suddenly works. You have to create the technology, you have to work with it, you have to sometimes you spend money and it doesn't work out the way you want it to work out. So it's a big risk for organizations, and I think many times they just say, well, let's just continue to do things the way we have. Here's where I think it's important for us to do more in the way of collaborating and to find technology great example, Dan, of what you're doing with Edelman, with independent sector is doing with Edelman. I think that you're showing that we can add a lot of value to the nonprofit sector constituents by working with an organization that's already in the field doing work that we need done. I think all of us have to think more that way. So that's why whether that can help us drive greater trust is sort of a double-edged sword, right? I mean, if we are accused of spending a lot of money on tech, how does that come out?
Yeah.
With donors, do they trust us less? But if we can be more effective as a result, and we can tell that story, I think it gives us an opportunity to prove that we are more trustworthy.
Super. Phoebe, anything you want to comment on?
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, I actually think as direct service providers, as nonprofits, we're held to a really different standard than we might hold a for-profit to. So there are not actually the mechanisms in place for us to make that investment unless philanthropy is going to partner with us and support it. Because the way government funding works, we actually don't get paid the full amount of what it costs us to deliver a service. Here in New York, we talk a lot about the sexy topic of indirect rates, but it matters when we're actually only paid 80 cents on the dollar for what it costs us to do the work, because there's no capacity to invest in the technology. So this too is a place where I think the trust between philanthropy, government, and nonprofit, that partnership needs to be enhanced so that it's actually dealing with the realities on the ground inside these organizations. The interesting thing also about technology is I think it's a great way to create greater proximity. And that to me is one of the pieces that's coming out of this survey. When I read the results about individuals who are attending religious services, to me, that's a participation in a community. It's giving us that proximity to the work, to the nonprofit in my community, right? To the local group that I trust. And so how do we actually build on that? And I do think that the ability to, as Victor, I think you said, the everyday people, to elevate those voices again about what is needed, that is a way through technology that we can bring those voices to the forefront. And I think we have to figure out how to do that in addition to all of the investment we need to make sure that we're running as effective and efficiently as possible.
If I could add one more point to that, which is, I think we as organizations have to figure out how to use these mediums, particularly the communication mediums, more like individuals are. I think, when there's a lot of attention given to something, it's usually because some individual or groups of maybe unorganized individuals have done something really interesting, and we tend to pay attention. Our competition isn't necessarily organizations. I hate to use the word competitions in a charity sense, but what's grabbing people's attention isn't necessarily what we put out about our organization. And I think we have to remember that people may not be as interested in our organizations as they are the specific things we're doing, the people who are doing them, how they're going about it. And I think organizationally, it's not just technology, it's how to use the technology and how to reach people in a way that resonates with them. And I don't know if people resonate with organizations, they seem to resonate more with peers. Yeah. And so as organizations, we got to figure out how to reach them as peers. That may be a convoluted statement I made, but I think you get the point.
Yeah, I think that is, it links beautifully to what Phoebe said as well, right? That there's something about the connection, whether virtual and authentic or interpersonal authentic, that is powerful driver for trust that allows people to interrogate whether an institution and individuals who are part of it, be them volunteers or professional staff, are worthy of their, kind of joining with to promote the common good. I mean, it's a big deal. So I want to just ask Victor a brief question. If there's anything specifically you just want to clarify, and then I'm going to ask one final question to Art and to Phoebe, and I'm going to make one point. Anything you want to add, Victor?
No, I think I completely agree about the point about participation in a community in terms of an explanation for the differences in trust for those who attend religious services and who don't. And I absolutely agree that, because as we've seen, I think in the question I mentioned, and also other research that has been done by Edelman and by Pew and other sources, that there is this preference for peers rather than institutions. And I think that is a definite challenge for the sector and for all institutions moving forward.
Yeah. So Phoebe, Art, as leaders in the sector in human services and philanthropy, what findings do you think we should have deeper conversations on in the near future as we develop and inform our plans to increase trust? If trust is a currency for the sector, growing trust will grow the ability for the sector to be more fully itself. What do you think we need to do based on these findings? What's really, should we pay more attention to? Phoebe, do you want to lead?
Oh, no small task there, Dan. I would love to see more information about the philanthropy component and understanding a little bit more about, is this corporate philanthropy? Is it private individuals? Where is that distrust? Because I think it could, to counter it, right, again, to this level of partnership, I think could be really, really powerful. The other place that I think we have to pay attention to is that Gen Z drop, because from a perspective of who are going to be our future donors, this is a group profoundly clearly disengaged from us and distrustful, that will actually ultimately mean we have less influence as a sector, less ability if we do not have the public behind us. So I'd love to think through how we actually engage that group, especially because they are all coming of age in this moment of a pandemic, in a moment of social unrest, political unrest. And that to me is the place where we actually have to create this greater sense of community and partnership. So I think that's the place I would encourage us. Not that I think that the older folks can't be influenced, but I think there's something really important about that generation.
Super. Art, final thoughts.
Sure. I would say this force for good notion is really important, because we're no longer the sole province of social good. I think we've always looked at the nonprofit sector as the place to go to do things that our society needs done that maybe business and government won't do. But increasingly, we're seeing at least perceptions that businesses are willing to do some things to drive society forward, and individuals are doing things on their own to drive society forward through activism and through maybe just joining forces with friends and neighbors and communities that aren't in an organized entity. And we're seeing, even government legislators who are constantly at each other's throats, it seems. Nonetheless, they're trying to, I think, determine which direction our nation will go, and they're not even working in an organized way to do it. So I wonder sometimes, Dan, if we don't need to do more to either partner with others outside of our sector who are also interested in positive change, and not just rely on a general sense that because we're the nonprofit sector, everyone's going to come to us, because I don't think that's how people necessarily see us anymore. We're no longer the sole arbiter of social good.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And a wake-up call for us, I think, based on this data. So this hopefully is just the tip of the iceberg of the kind of meaning making and understanding. We've got two extraordinary sector leaders, Phoebe Boyer, CEO of Children's Aid, and Art Taylor, CEO of BBB Wise Giving. Terrific overview by Victor Ptolomeo, senior researcher from Edelman Data and Intelligence. And I got to give a shout out to Allison Grayson, who is a director of policy development and analysis at Independent Sector and really leads this work internally and is really the mastermind behind this. And a huge thanks to all of you who participated. This will be available to your colleagues. We really would not only encourage you to share it, but if there is learning and feedback and questions, this only gets better with people, raising questions and challenging us. So thank you. This is part of a larger report on the health of the U.S. nonprofit sector, which will be released in the fall. So look for that. And those of you who are getting off, there'll be a survey. We ask you to fill it out. We believe in data. We pay attention to what you say, and we change our behavior as a result. And finally, if you have any further questions, you can contact Chris Brian Rubio. I'm going to ask him to put his email address in the chat, and he will follow up. So huge thank you. As a good friend says, drink while you pour. So stay healthy, and particularly as we navigate this next phase of the pandemic. And again, huge thanks to everyone who participated in this hot summer day. Have a great one, everyone.